I really am delighted to be here. So thanks again to Meg, the Pioneers Museum, Giddings Foundation, also to my colleague John Harner, who is here. I guess I can either thank him or blame him for recommending me for this. And I'm going to say a little bit about this, how I wound up here to talk about Colorado Springs, because if you paid attention to the bio and my research, might not make a whole lot of sense why I'm talking about Colorado Springs. But there is a connection to some of my past work. So just so you know, I have a long-term book project called Who Governs in God's City. It's on Colorado Springs, and I'll be talking about some of the things that are going to be in that book. The most famous book ever written on urban politics, by the way, was called Who Governs by Robert Dahl. It was on a study at New Haven, Connecticut. Very famous, at least academic book on urban politics. So I moved here in 2004 to teach at UCCS. I was very fortunate to get a job at a wonderful institution like UCCS in a wonderful location. And as you probably heard from my bio, I spent a lot of time writing on the courts, and particularly the courts in education. That's my primary research focus. My dissertation was on a case out of Kansas City, Missouri, called Missouri versus Jenkins, the Supreme Court's last statement on desegregation. And because of my research on that, I developed a bad habit, which was paying attention to school board meetings. And so when I moved here in 2004, we were in the middle, at least in D11 in Colorado Springs, in the middle of a significant controversy over the direction of District 11. In 2003, a slate of reform candidates had run and taken over the school board, but there was some controversy that developed when one member of the slate didn't end up supporting the agenda of the slate, and so there ended up being lots of controversial issues regularly reported on the local news, maybe public access television. I don't really remember, but I do remember this. I was watching something about the school board meeting. It was very controversial, and the issue was whether or not Planned Parenthood should be allowed in D11 schools. And I'll say much more about the broader reputation of Colorado Springs in a few minutes here. But I'm certain you all know what some people think about Colorado Springs, given the reputation of the city. It's the Evangelical Vatican, those kinds of things. So for some people coming from outside the city, I don't think I had this illusion. I wasn't laboring under this illusion, but it was striking to me that there was even a debate at all. Right? If the reputation of the city matched, if the reality of the city matched the reputation of the city, why was there even a debate? And I believe that the board ended up voting to not prevent Planned Parenthood from coming into D11 schools. So how could this actually be in the Evangelical Vatican? Well, it turns out that things are a lot more complicated than people realize in Colorado Springs. By the way, of course, I had a similar issue. We had a D11, another slave candidates ran this past time, supported by Steve Schuck, who also supported them back in 2003. I'll go ahead and tell you, when I moved to Colorado Springs, I heard that Steve Schuck was here. I was very excited because I found out he was the brother of Peter Schuck, who is a famous professor from Yale, at least in my area. In judicial policy making, he's one of the leading figures. I was so excited. Oh, well, Peter Schuck's brother is in Colorado Springs. And I've gotten to be able to get to know him a little bit and actually bring his brother out for election at UCCS. So some things never change, right? Issues have been now recycled here. So that's where my interest came from. Because of my interest in education policy, and then seeing what was going on here, and seeing that the politics of the city were much different than some people likely would have expected. And I do think that makes them more interesting, because some people do think that we're on the verge of some kind of incipient theocracy or some kind of theological tyranny. And after all, for political scientists, tyranny is kind of a boring political system, right? It's not a whole lot to explain. So it actually makes it a lot more interesting to study when there's not a single group that's in control of everything. I'll also say this. Robert Dahl's book, Who Governs, takes the position that pluralism is what best explains politics in the United States, but particularly in New Haven, Connecticut, and more broadly. And pluralism is basically the idea that there are lots of groups and individuals, elites, voters, whoever, who are all fighting for interests. Sometimes some people control things, sometimes others, but there's often no single group that is going to run everything in any particular community, or certainly in the United States. And I think that's the case here in Colorado Springs as well. The broader book projects, just so you know, will focus on what you could call interest group politics, because one of the things that I think is fascinating about Colorado Springs is that you have all the elements that are influential in the national conservative movements that are present in Colorado Springs. And this is a very conservative city, there's no doubt about that, but they're here. And there's been much research on the national conservative movement over the last 20 to 30 years. For a long time, I think the conservative movement was ignored. I think sometimes people were just kind of hoping it would go away, but it didn't. And so it turns out that if you want to understand politics, particularly at the national level, you have to understand conservatism. But most of the research is focused on national conservatism, but there's almost nothing on conservatism at the local level. And so if you look in Colorado Springs, you have the social conservatives, you have the national defense, you have the Chamber of Commerce types, you have the anti-tax, libertarian kinds of conservatives. So they're all here, so it makes it interesting for that reason. But then the book will also look at, perhaps during the question and answer period, maybe talk about this as well, some of the institutional changes in the city that we've experienced over the last 10 to 12 years. Just looking at the move from a council manager system to a strong mayor system. So it's going to look at both of those. All right, but let me say a little bit more about Colorado Springs' reputation, just in case you aren't convinced that it has a particular reputation. Right? But there are two aspects to it. One will be the socially conservative Evangelical Vatican side, but then also the part of the reputation that this is this anti-tax libertarian utopia for those who support those kinds of positions. All right, so just give a couple of examples on both. The New York Times, when John Hickenlooper was running for governor the first time, so 11 years ago now, and one of their articles said this: Colorado is the home of the backpackers of Boulder and the Bible thumpers of Colorado Springs. We even have a global reputation. Richard Dawkins. You know who Richard Dawkins is? Famous British evolutionary scientist, but also outspoken atheist. Back in 2006, he took a kind of Margaret Mead anthropological style expedition to the United States, and particularly he wanted to study why irrational faith was flourishing in America. So guess where he came? Here. Yes, some of you might have been familiar with this. He came here, right? And he ended up going to New Life Church, got kicked out of there. But he did find one beleaguered group of people that called itself the Free Thinkers Group, and then he said they must meet furtively, perhaps to fantasize about moving to Canada. Right? So we have a global reputation. Now what about this kind of libertarian, anti-government, low tax, that reputation? I'll just give you one example. From back in 2009, Proposition 2C. I actually had to go look at that. I can't even remember what the propositions were on the ballot, 2-3 months ago, right? So, but 2C, this was back when City Council said, if you don't vote for this tax increase, we're shutting off a bunch of services, we're turning off street lights, we aren't emptying the trash at the city parks, those kinds of things. This got a lot of news, national and international news. So Governing Magazine ran an article about Colorado Springs. It said, the city is famously right-wing, and property taxes here are some of the lowest in the nation. I ended up being called by some international outlets, a couple of reporters from Canada, and I think I have to go back and look, maybe even some from Europe. They're interested in what was going on in this place called Colorado Springs. Somehow they got my name. And I think it's only a slight exaggeration. I think at least some of this international media all but thought that Colorado Springs was going to descend into Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, where it's going to be a war of all against all. We're going to be slaughtering each other in the streets. They couldn't believe that there was such a place like Colorado Springs that was so anti-tax. Right? So this is our reputation. So now I want to talk a little bit about continuity and change, and then we'll get to what I'm calling some paradoxes of politics here in Colorado Springs. So first, continuity and change on the Evangelical Vatican. I mean, what's interesting is that this actually goes back to the very beginning of Colorado Springs. In some ways, what we see is not entirely new. There were some points that ended up being some inflection points that I think changed the reputation of the city, but they didn't fundamentally alter what was actually happening in Colorado Springs. Go back to Gerald Palmer. After all, he's a Quaker, and he established Colorado Springs as a dry town. He wanted to be a place for good temperance folks, right? That's what Colorado Springs was supposed to be. But then you just look at the evangelical organizations that have been in Colorado Springs and were here before, of course, Focus on the Family famously came. Young Life, 1946. Navigators, 1953. Bought Glen Eyrie. I think they even bought it from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Ministries. Is that right? It's been a while since I just know that Navigators bought it, moved in 1953. Compassion International moved late 70s, 1980. To Colorado Springs. The International Bible Society, now Biblica, came in 1988. And then of course, and here's where things really start to change. Focus on the Family comes in 1991. And then you get the passage of Amendment 2. Amendment 2 in 1992. Now sometimes people equate the passage of Amendment 2 with Focus on the Family arriving. But if you actually talk to the people at Focus on the Family who are involved in their political side, this Amendment 2 almost took someone by surprise. They supported it, but it was not their issue. However, Amendment 2 did largely originate in Colorado Springs. Of course, ended up getting supporters from around the state, otherwise it wouldn't have passed. But Denver had passed as a result of a Human Rights Commission recommendation, statute in 1990, and then there's a proposal for the state to do it in 1991, and then a group of Colorado Springs citizens formed an organization, proposed Amendment 2, which would then forbid any jurisdiction from making sexual orientation a protected class across the state. This then ended up being overturned by the Supreme Court in Romer versus Evans. But that, in some ways, solidified the national reputation of Colorado Springs. So people talk about Colorado as the state of hate, and then they would dig a little deeper. Where did this proposal come from? Oh, it was Colorado Springs, right? Now, the Republican, Libertarian, anti-tax side of things. Once again, there's continuity here. First of all, Colorado Springs has always been, and El Paso County has always been a very Republican area. So, Judge H.W. Baldwin actually, in an article, said something about the same old stories as usual. This is talking about election from 1891. As usual, El Paso County has elected the entire Republican ticket by majorities ranging from 500 to 1,000. This is 1891. Then in 1899, the Colorado Springs Weekly Gazette called William Jennings Bryan a champion of the forces of discontent and confusion. They called his rhetoric demagogic claptrap, passionate appeals to class prejudice and to selfish interests. You also saw it with conflicts over the Ku Klux Klan, because rather notoriously, the KKK essentially controlled politics throughout Colorado, at least for a good portion of the 1920s, but there was one exception to that, and it was Colorado Springs. But part of the reason for that was because of this long-time kind of pro-business interest of the community. So, Robert Goldberg, in his book, Hooded Empire, the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado, he said, anti-Klansmen organized the Bipartisan Citizens Committee to counter the Klan's challenge. The committee's membership was a roll call of the social, economic, political, and intellectual elite of Colorado Springs. The Gazette then said this. They called it an alien influence. And they said, will the city stand for mass rule? The issue cannot be evaded. It is whether the Pikes Peak region is to be brought to its knees by a masked and secret order, the existence of which violates every principle of American democracy. The KKK is declared to be a destructive influence. Then later on, Thayer Tutt, in an interview, said, the bottom line is the Klan was bad for business. And anything that was bad for business, Spencer Penrose, was against. But you also see this reputation in national politics. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, you have conflict between the Western Federation of Miners, concentrated in Cripple Creek, versus the mine owners here in Colorado Springs. Then you have the Cold War throughout much of the 20th century. And we all know about the development of the defense establishment here in El Paso County with Peterson NORAD, Cheyenne Mountain, Air Force Academy, Trevor, etc. Now also interestingly, the Libertarian Party, such as it is, was actually founded in Colorado Springs in 1971. Sometimes people don't realize this. But there are actually some pretty prominent people involved in the early history of the Libertarian Party. I think it's interesting that it was actually founded here in Colorado Springs. But then again, you have an inflection points. 1991 and 1992 again. What happens in 1991? You get Tabor in Colorado Springs. And then Tabor is taken statewide in 1992. And then this solidifies the reputation of Colorado Springs. So Eric Sonderman, in an interview with me, put it this way. He said, a Colorado Springs Republican is not a reference to a geographic region. It's a pejorative. He said, the two most controversial initiatives in Colorado history both have Colorado Springs as a return address. You're talking about Amendment 2 in Tabor. Right? So these two things really do, I think, solidify the reputation of the city. So now I want to talk about some of what I've called the paradoxes of politics in Colorado Springs. The first one. It turns out that the Evangelical Vatican is one of America's most secular cities. The Evangelical Vatican is one of America's most secular cities. In 2012, a Gallup survey of 244,000 Americans found that Colorado Springs was the 134th most religious city out of 189 surveyed. Only 35.3% of the respondents in Colorado Springs said that they were highly religious. That's a lower percentage than Los Angeles and Chicago. And 39.3% said that they were not religious at all. That was a higher percentage than New York City and Las Vegas. Sin City. Hey, Sin City has more devout believers, highly religious individuals than Colorado Springs. Las Vegas. Right? In 2010, the U.S. religion census, by the way, we're waiting on the results for the 2020 religious census. I don't think there's going to be much change, but except a downward trend everywhere across the country on some of these numbers, found that in El Paso County, only 33.4% of the population was religious. That was a decline from 37.1% in 2000. By the way, our 33.4% compared to 35.3% in San Francisco. San Francisco, less religious than less religious than Las Vegas, less religious than San Francisco. 35.7% in Denver, in Jefferson County, and then 49.4% in New York City. So, the Evangelical Vatican, once again, turns out to be fairly secular. Even though, I don't know how many, I haven't counted recently, how many evangelical nonprofits have either offices or their headquarters here. It's a substantial number, 100 to 150 is my guess. That does not translate into a large, what you call, evangelical workforce. Tom Minery, who had been at Focus on the, who's retired from Focus on the Family, he was the director of their Government and Public Policy Division. Several years ago, when I interviewed him, he estimated that less than 3,000 people worked for the city's evangelical organizations. Less than 3,000. So you have a lot of organizations, but that doesn't translate to a lot of voters or people. So what are the effects of this paradox that it's known as the Evangelical Vatican, but it turns out to be a fairly secular place? Sometimes it means that you get more liberal policies, or maybe perhaps libertarian policies than you would expect. I think the best example of this is marijuana. You look at Amendment 20 and Amendment 64. Amendment 20 with legalizing medical marijuana, passed in 2000. Amendment 64, 2012. Both passed with slight majorities in El Paso County. Didn't match the majorities statewide, but not that far off. Right? But still, slight majorities in El Paso County supported both. And then you had this massive explosion in dispensaries after 2009. So President Obama comes into office and his Justice Department announced that it would not prosecute individuals who were in compliance with state laws for drug violations. And so that was just a big signal to, if you want a dispensary, go for it. And in fact, for a while, I don't know if this is the case anymore, but for a long time, the state's oldest and largest dispensary was here in Colorado Springs, Cannabis Therapeutics. I'm certain, much to Boulder's chagrin, this was the case, right? But we had this explosion of dispensaries. At one point, we had 169. Colorado Avenue, I don't know if it's still called this, but for a while it was called Cannabis Avenue. But in true free market El Paso County fashion, there's a reduction in the number of dispensaries as the less efficient ones, or ones not meeting the market demand in the way that the market wanted. The number dropped to under 80, but now I think it's back up to around 120 dispensaries in Colorado Springs. Now, for those of you who worry that this significant drop in the number of dispensaries, that our medical needs will go unmet, somehow our coffee needs are supplied by 34 Starbucks in Colorado Springs. So I think that we'll be okay. And then if you look at Colorado Springs City Council, there was never really a serious effort. There was some talk about trying to put a ballot measure. I think there were 4 votes on City Council at the time out of 9 votes. But the council itself never actually considered prohibition, even though that was allowed under state law. Really the closest that we've got in Colorado Springs to trying to even limit the growth was a feeble, what economists call Baptist, and political scientists too, but an economist came up with the phrase, I love it, Baptist and Bootlegger coalition. Baptist and Bootlegger coalitions. At the end of Prohibition, there were 2 groups that opposed getting rid of Prohibition. The Baptists and the Bootleggers. And so in Colorado Springs, there was talk for a little while about the existing dispensaries wanting to cap the growth of new dispensaries, and then some of the social conservatives wanting to join forces just to limit the growth of the number of dispensaries. But that was really it. Another example where you didn't get, you ended up getting a policy that the social conservatives agreed with, but I think it's pretty telling how they actually got the policy. So I'm guessing most of you have been in Colorado Springs for a while. Back in the early 2000s, there was this debate over same-sex benefits for city employees. A former colleague of mine, Mary Lou McPeace, was the mayor of the city at the time. She supported this. City council voted for it, and then a new city council came in and then rescinded this. Right? So this got a lot of attention. However, you go back and read about the debates over this. There was very little what you could call moral debate about it. Instead, most of the debate focused on the budgetary implications of increasing the people who could receive benefits on the city's benefit plans. That's tended to be what it focused on. So there wasn't even really much of a direct confrontation on the grounds that you would think that social conservatives would want to address it on. Lionel Rivera, for instance, who ended up being elected mayor, did an interview with a focus on the family program, and most of his comments were focused on this is going to increase costs for the city, and therefore that's why I oppose it. And so, of course, in Colorado Springs, maybe you could say that's the biggest sin of all, right? Would be to increasing government spending. Now, one other effect that I think you can see from this might be a little bit controversial, but I think it's true, is that the city's reputation as the Evangelical Vatican tends to benefit the city's progressive community. Tends to benefit. That doesn't mean that progressives run Colorado Senate. I'm not saying that at all. But at times, progressives in the city have used the reputation of Colorado Springs to try and get leverage for preferred policies. Or even you go back to the first Strong Mayor campaign. Part of what Richard Scorman did was argue that Colorado Springs has a reputation for being this intolerant city, and so support me, right? And he'd end up managing to get on in the runoff in 2011. So I do think that in some ways it helps motivate the progressive community, and the progressive community in Colorado Springs can use it to its advantage. And it's an advantage precisely because it doesn't match the reality. It's just there are enough evangelical voters out there to control things in the city. All right, the second paradox of politics in Colorado Springs is that the city, I'm speaking broadly, sort of in general, you would say, the city dislikes, maybe loathes, may not be too strong a word, government spending, but it desperately needs it. It desperately needs it. One main reason, military spending. Right, military spending. That's, we all know that the military, it's still the biggest employer in the city, correct? In El Paso County, the number of retired, it's just, it feeds so much of the economy. I think it's only a slight exaggeration to say that the primary job of Doug Lamborn is to preserve defense spending in El Paso County. Okay, that's his job for most people who live here. So in defense, though, no pun intended, of Colorado Springs, you could say, well, defense is one of the few truly public goods that there actually are. And so you're going to have the defense spending, and a public good is one that's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Turns out that lots of stuff are called public goods that aren't public goods, but defense is one, right? And so you say, well, you're going to have defense spending, so it might as well be us. Right? The problem here, I think, is that there's still an awful lot of waste. Right? There's just no doubt that there's a lot of waste. But this then ends up having effects on local politics. It ends up affecting local politics. In fact, I think it increases the presence of the defense industry and the Pentagon, all the defense locations in Colorado Springs. It ends up increasing skepticism about taxes. And I think in a couple of ways. The defense departments, the Department of Defense, is the most wasteful bureaucracy in the history of the world. I don't think this is debatable. I mean, it's a huge bureaucracy. And I'm not trying to pick on the Department of Defense for this. It's this way for a couple of reasons. One, all monopolies are wasteful. It's a monopoly. But since it's a public good, it has to be a monopoly. Right? So that's one reason. A second reason is because of the nature of our political system. Right? This is why we have bases and people that strategically located in states and congressional districts throughout the country, and every single state and every congressional district wants to preserve them. Right? No one wants to see their bases getting closed. Right? This is why it's always a traumatic thing when there's a base closure commission. And so it generates some of the waste. And people who work in the Department of Defense will tell you this. But it's just a necessary part of doing business. It's a necessary part of doing business. I remember interviewing Richard Scorman several years ago about this, and one of the things that he told me, he says, I talked to a lot of former members of the military, current members of the military, and they'll tell me the reason that I'm not voting for taxes is because I worked in the Department of Defense. And so I saw government waste firsthand. So it just naturally increased their skepticism. A second way, though, is just because of the nature of the military itself. If you just look at members of the military, they tend to be more conservative, which often means being more opposed to tax increases. That's particularly true for officers. For the enlisted, it's not quite as true, but for officers, at one point it's something like 7 out of every 8 members of the officer corps was a Republican. Right? It's really an exception to the general rule that if you work for the national government, you're likely going to vote Democratic. Right? So, I will say this as well about one of the effects of this, is that this does sometimes, this dependence on federal spending, would say, can sometimes cause the city's conservatives to tolerate and even support heresies that they would normally condemn. One example of this was the Pinyon Canyon expansion proposal back in 2009, 2010. All right, so you know anything about Colorado Springs, this is very conservative, libertarian property rights, right? And government exercising eminent domain over people's property is not something that you're supposed to like. But in Colorado Springs, everyone supported the exercise of eminent domain over land surrounding Pinyon Canyon. Josh Penry was seeking the Republican nomination, along with many others. It got to be a very kind of strange campaign for Republicans that year across the state. But he was running, and he criticized this is government abuse of its power of eminent domain. And he was then accused by Republicans in Colorado Springs of being anti-military. Right? So again, it complicates the picture. The third paradox, final paradox, and then we'll stop, take some questions, is that Colorado Springs evangelicals exercise more influence in national politics than local politics. Exercise more influence in national politics than local politics. This doesn't mean that evangelicals are without influence locally. That's not what I'm arguing. But that they simply lack the power, as the numbers that I gave prove, to control city politics. Instead, locally, as pluralist theory would predict, they work with other groups, softening their stances on some issues, being more accommodating, to get some of what they want, but maybe not everything that they want, just like everyone else does. Right? So, there aren't enough of them. As well, this is another reason, is that I think two of the most important issues to social conservatives are both completely federalized now, through the courts. And so that means that some of the things that might motivate people to get interested and engaged in local politics, local government can't really do a whole lot about them. And those two issues would be abortion and same-sex marriage. Right? And Obergefell versus Hodges, of course, settled that issue at the national level. However, it does play a significant role in national politics. The evangelicals focus on the family, if nothing else, just because of its size and its large email database, can play a significant role in mobilizing the evangelical movement and then framing what the evangelical movement is going to focus on. So, you look at the abortion issue, for instance. Focus on the family played a major role. A friend of mine who taught at UCCS for a year with me, we ended up co-authoring a book together. He ended up studying the pro-life movement, and the pro-life movement moved away from the Randall Terry side of things to one that was really driven by focus on the family, which was less about direct confrontation, but more of a dialogue, you would say. And that really has changed the nature of the pro-life movement across the country. It was driven, I think, in substantial part because of people here in Colorado Springs at focus on the family. Another reason that it influences national politics is that there are network effects that result when you have so many organizations that are all part of this same general community. And some of these people they influence things at the local level, but then they go on to influence things at the national level as well. So you can, for instance, look at the charter school movement. There are people who were influential in helping start charter schools in Colorado Springs that then ended up going on and occupying pretty significant national positions in the school choice movement. All right. So in conclusion. I think there's a question in the end. I'm going to go back to but it deals with both elements of this reputation of Colorado Springs. I think the question is whether or not social conservatives have influenced Colorado Springs more than Colorado Springs has influenced social conservatives. Because if you look at a lot of the issues that the city has addressed, for instance, the Strong Mayor campaign. You talk to the people who ran the Strong Mayor campaign, and you say, well, did you actually have a strategy for the social conservatives in Colorado Springs? Like, no, we just treated them like ordinary El Paso County conservative Republican voters. Basically, who are these people? What do we have in El Paso County? Well, they're people who largely want lower taxes and to some degree be left alone. And I think on local issues, and particularly, that's how the social conservatives tend to vote, which would indicate that, and there's a whole lot of causation issues that you have to address, like how much, but I do think that you have many of the social conservatives who have come to Colorado Springs who have ended up becoming, you could say, more like your modal Colorado Springs voter than vice versa.